I went to university in again still in Exeter actually, and I did sociology instead, which was a big difference. Quite enjoyed myself really. There were no hard sums to go with it, so that was quite a relief. And yes, it was a very different idea. I'm going to show you, share my screen, I hope. Where are we? Yeah, that's the one, I think. Let me see if I can get that one up. Right, that's going back. Let's get back to there. I went all the way through it, obviously, before you came, just to see. So I will start from the beginning. And what I'd like to discuss is sociology a science? Now, when I was younger and I was doing a chemistry degree, I'd have said, no, no way. It's much too airy-fairy, and how could they possibly consider it a science? But since doing sociology, I must confess, I'm completely taken with it. As far as I'm concerned, yes, it is a science, and you'll see why. Okay, what is a science? The first thing to think about is, what is a science? What do we consider a science? Well, it's organized. You have to think what you're going to what hypothesis you're going to test. You have to think what you're hoping to achieve from it, and you organize the method that you're going to use. You have to be systematic, and quite often one thing will be accumulating on the next one. So it's often thought of that sciences are all very mathematical, but some aren't. We'll test our hypotheses using mathematical formulae and such like, won't we? But most importantly, if we say something is true, then it must be able to be reviewed by our peers. So if I turn around and say red is blue, then I've got to have proof. And I've got to say to the all my peers that why I think this is true. And then they will come along and say, don't talk such rubbish. Okay? So, is this all true of sociology? Well, I think people think that all that happens with sociology is that we think of something, we say it, and for that reason it's true. But it's not. We're not like it. We still actually have to test our hypothesis. So if I say that when children are at school, boys do better than girls, then I would have to prove that. But it would be a very sociological thing to look at. And we often do try to do these things. So we'd have to actually prove it before we can actually say it. In the same way as you cannot say that pressure and temperature are linked. You have to prove that. And I would say that, in fact, we're not really totally sure that all the hard sciences, such as physics and chemistry, can be proved, because they do change. We don't really realize how much things have changed over even our lifetime. So when I was at school, there was an atom, and an atom consisted of protons, electrons, and neutrons. Okay, that was quite reasonable. But when we got a little bit further into it, nowadays they're talked about quarks and things like that. Things have changed slightly. They've got a whole new paradigm of knowledge, haven't they? So the whole thing has slightly altered. So I don't think they are necessarily quite as straightforward as people seem to think. Right, you will have learned in school how to carry out and write up an experiment. I don't suppose there's too many people who didn't do some sort of experiment at some times in their school life. You were taught to use an idea that you took an observation, and I'm going to move myself over there, and then you researched it, and then you come up with a hypothesis, i.e. that the pressure is related to the volume of a gas. You then test it with an experiment. You do several bits of data, draw a graph usually, report the conclusions. All right, and that's a typical experimental way of proving things. Right, we learned that the scientific community will then test that theory that you come across. So they will test what you have decided. And they will sometimes say, no, that's not true. So that scientists that said that to have the vaccines for mumps and rubella and so on were going to give a finite number of children autism, we all accepted it because he wrote it up beautifully in the in all of the various newspapers, and we all believed him. But when the actual scientific community went and looked at his experimentation and tried to repeat his experiments, they couldn't do so. And in the end, it was all decided that it wasn't right and that he had just made much of it up. But by then it was too late. So many people decided not to have their children vaccinated, and they're still doing so, aren't they? So they say now that if you're vaccinated against COVID, you will become impotent. That's the latest one, right? And people are believing it. And for that reason, they're not getting vaccinated. They've got to give us some proof. Right, now, as far as I'm concerned, I think of all the scientists, and I don't know if other people do this, they have a rainbow effect. So that sociology is one of the softer sciences. Physics is harder, not more difficult, but more solid. When something's proved in physics, it's much harder to disprove it. But in sociology, it's a little bit more fluid. Somebody will come up and say, yes, I do believe that boys are cleverer than girls, and that's why they get better results. And then some other sociologist will come up and say, well, actually, they're about the same. So we have the soft and the fluid science against the hard and the solid science. And we have all the things in between. So you've got meteorology, weather science. Is that immutable? If you get a cloudy day, will it necessarily rain? Right? It could be just like it was this morning. It was a beautiful day, but it was cloudy. It wasn't very sunny. And we've all remember him, do we? He comes out and he told us all, oh no, we wouldn't have a hurricane. And that night we had a hurricane. And I expect, no, you're a little bit far away from there, wasn't it? But it was right across the southeast when it just went across, didn't it? And caused untold damage. The Seven Oaks became Four Oaks or something, because all of them went. So what am I going to do? I'm going to talk about what is sociology, and then I'm going to talk about how we conduct sociological research. So we do research, and you'll see there, typical thing, sociology, like any other science, is a body of knowledge, and its methods are based on systematic research. Now, natural science is a study of physical features of nature and the way they interact. So perhaps we're talking about epidemiology. How do these vaccines work against the various different pandemic things that are going on at the moment? But social science would really be much more interested in how it has affected us by locking down. So have we all been badly affected? Or have we just shrugged our shoulders and got on with things? Interesting to see what would happen later. I think there will be a lot of research into whether or not that will have happened, whether we have actually managed to escape too many bad effects of it. Right, so what is sociology? Now, please tell me if you want to ask a question. I don't quite know how you do that. I think you just unmute yourself and say it, don't you? And I'm quite willing. I'll see your little light come up, won't I? I think. So what is sociology? Okay. I liked this one. I thought this was fairly typical. What is sociology? You're new here, aren't you? Now, what's he doing that's different from everybody else? He's striping his lawn in the opposite direction. Everybody else in the area stripes it vertically, and he does it horizontally. He's not following the norm. And you've probably heard of a norm, N-O-R-M. It's the normal way that people were reacting in that area. Okay, so none of us actually really live on our own, do we? We're all members of groups such as families, schools, churches, workplaces, U3A. All of them affect how we think of things. Do you agree? And that is going to change your perspective on yourself and your fellow members of these groups. So if you went to, say, Eton, you'd probably think that all children spoke with a beautiful accent and they had a fairly unlimited money. But if you went to the local comprehensive, you might not quite appreciate it in the same way. Right, so it's the study of society, the society we live in, and it looks at how the various groups and organizations influence and is influenced by its members. So different workplaces will have different thoughts about what's going on in the outside world. If you are, say, a very good computer teacher or a very good computer boffin, shall we say, you won't think about things in the same way as the person that's on the factory floor. Right? Life, for a start, will probably be a lot harder for the person on the factory floor because they haven't got as much money. So one of the first people to actually talk about sociology as a study that could be done is somebody called Auguste Comte, and he was French, and he first started talking about it in the middle 19th century, and he was just about, the French Revolution had just about finished, so he was fairly free to continue his studies. And he was intrigued that people could live in harmony. He felt that it should be possible for us to live in harmony. you can sort of see this idea of the French Revolution. So many people had been killed. Now he was hoping that we could actually get by and we could live in harmony again. He felt that science of the social would be the greatest of sciences. So he wanted to know how we actually do react to each other. Do you see what I mean? Right. Now, is science based on fact? Well, up to a point. I would argue it's not completely based on fact. Because if you think about things like you have always been taught, there's been a movement instigated when a particular type of scientist has come along. So at one point, we believed the Earth was flat, and we were absolutely positive because we could see the horizon. And obviously, when ships went over there, they went over the edge and were never heard of again. That was the end of them. So it was a flat Earth. But slowly, as people did go over there, they changed their ideas and they thought, maybe it's not so flat after all. And they come up with this idea of the Earth is round. And then we start thinking, okay, well, we all go round the sun, or does the sun go round us? We don't know. We'll have to investigate. Somebody called Karl Popper. Has anyone heard of Karl Popper? Yes? Put your hand up if you have. Save you unmuting. Yeah? Karl Popper? He's really fascinating if you want a good one. Oh yes, there's some that have. Good. Right, well, I find him quite interesting because he comes up with all sorts of scientific work as well as straightforward social science. So he's a mixture, a bit more like I am, I suppose, a bit of a mixture. So he disputes this idea. He thinks that science is actually all about falsification. So what he's saying is, according to Popper, scientists are always trying to prove that their theories are wrong. So we proved that the Earth was not flat by going round to the other side. We prove that the moon is round because there is something round the back there. We take a rocket, we go round and we have a look, and there it is. All right, so we prove things are wrong. And his big one, look at that, beautiful. All swans are white. All right, have you seen that? Have you heard of this one? All swans are white. But, of course, that's until you find a black one. Right? So it's falsification, isn't it? All swans are white. That was a simple theory until you find the black one. And he actually said no number of sightings of white swans can prove the theory that all swans are white, but the sighting of just one black one may disprove it. All right, so sociologists are very keen on getting down to the bottom of it. Right, so science and sociology. One of the big ones, another very important man, is this man here. He is Durkheim, and he became just a group of scientists that were looking at society as it is and continuing with it that way. So there were loads of them that we have all heard of: Confucius, Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas. I like putting him in because he's not classical, is he? And then there's a Muslim called Ibn Khaldun. And they were all looking at social science. They didn't have ways of doing physics or chemistry or anything like that, but they could do things about society as a whole. Now, Durkheim was one of the founding fathers of social sciences. He worked on this idea that how society could be improved. He found he had a lot of experimental data, and he found that Protestants, who tended to be more highly educated, had a higher rate of suicide than Catholics, who tended to have a lower level of education. So he was very sure that your likelihood of committing suicide was to do with the level of education that you do. Right? And he wrote a great long thing. He did loads of experimental data, lots of graphs, and everybody thought that. Right? And it was a good piece of work. Anyone think why it's not the truth? What do you think? Why do Catholics not commit suicide? Are they happier? I don't think they are. I think it's a completely different reason. They didn't commit suicide because, as far as they were concerned, if they did, they would go to hell. So, if somebody did commit suicide, their relatives would make sure that it was not put down as suicide. Otherwise, they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. So it wasn't suicide, was it? They'd say they fell off the bridge. Not they cast themselves off the bridge. They fell off the bridge. Right? So, oh dear, I think I'm doing things that I shouldn't. Oh, there it is. So, not all of the stuff that we think is good for social sciences, we've got to think carefully about what we're saying. And a lot of things that we do say, and you'll see them in the newspapers, you'll think, I don't agree with that. Right? So, I keep moving you all around. Okay. How do sociologists carry out research? Well, you probably again see some of the results of sociological research. It gets put into the newspapers quite a bit. And there's a very strong link between journalism and sociology. But sociological research, as can most sciences, be either quantitative or qualitative. And if you did any chemistry at higher levels, you knew that you could have qualitative research and you could have quantitative research. Quantitative actually involved numbers, and qualitative just involved looking at things and seeing what you thought they'd look like. Okay? If you did A-level chemistry, you would do qualitative analysis, where you just tried to discover what the substance was by looking at colours and what it felt like and so on. And you would have quantitative, which would be all that business with the burette and titration and so on. Right? So quantitative research looks at social surveys. So if we're doing a sociological bit of quantitative research, we can look at social surveys that have already been done. So you might want to look at something along, whoops, that all went backwards. Why is that doing that to me? Right, I'm going backwards. Why am I doing that? Right. So you look at something like this. All right, they're trying to work out what sort of numbers of people have been killed at the moment. 2019, it's quite a new recent type of research, and they find that in the general numbers, female and male, right, looking at the two differences, female ones and male ones, right, and the majority of people that are killed would be men aged 20 to 29. So young men would be the majority. Young women, although we think of a typical homicide of a woman, you know, she's walking through the woods and some man comes up and kills her, probably isn't that at all. It's more likely to have been a man that was killed, a young man that was killed by another young man. And as you see down at the bottom there, as you get older and older, you're even less likely to get killed. So that was quite interesting to us, right? They've used data that was already available, but they didn't actually have to find that data themselves. They could just go on the Social Surveys website, and there's loads of stuff that you can do, and you can pick up a survey that you need that has been done correctly. But you may also have seen the odd one with a student standing around with a clipboard, and they will have a questionnaire that they've made up themselves, and they will be ticking the boxes. Okay? You might have been stopped by such a student and asked, please, could you help me fill in my questionnaire? All right, anyone had any of those people around? I don't know where your nearest university is, but certainly when we were living in Plymouth, it was a common occurrence for a student to come up and say to us, could you help me fill in my survey? And it was quite good. I used to like it. If somebody would do that, it'd be good fun. Right, so that's our quantitative research, but you can also have qualitative research. Now, this is where people say, oh, sociology, it's just a load of sort of nothing, nebulous, right? We can just get on with it and we can say what we like. I could say black is white and nobody would quibble. But qualitative research is still as repeatable by its peer group. So you can have qualitative research in effect, something like an observation. So at the moment, I could be doing a qualitative research analysis of all of you. And I could look at you and I could say, oh, all right, Steve Ratford, he's looking quite intent. Yeah. But maybe Jenny and Andy might not be quite as attentive, but yeah, there they are. I could look at you all and I could make a tick box about it. What are you doing? Yeah. And that observation could be participant or non-participant. Right, by that I mean the interview could be just, I could come up with my clipboard and ask you questions. And I could say, so how do you think that the COVID pandemic has been handled? And you'll say, oh, I think it's absolute rubbish, and I've been doing so and so, and I think that we should never have been locked down, and we certainly shouldn't have been given 2 jabs, blah, de, blah, de, blah. And I would be probably ticking off, you know, they mention jabs, they mention being locked down, and all of that sort of thing. Okay? So it's an open interview. Usually at the end of a questionnaire, you have an open question and you ask people to say what they think. But you could also look at some of the secondary qualitative, I'm going to come back to the participant and non-participant. You could also use secondary qualitative data. You could use historical documents. You could use personal documents such as diaries and letters. So you could be sitting down writing a diary every single day about your experience of lockdown. And that would be a very useful piece of documentation as years go by. You could look at mass media, and you could look at things like TV documentaries, and maybe you could, if you were that way able, you could look at people's blogs. I don't quite know how you look at a blog, but you could look at a blog. You could have historical documents now, such as this one, Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Now, what he's talking about there is the last plague, the Black Plague, right? And he's written a journal about what was going on, and this is absolutely invaluable. He actually was telling us about fairly ordinary people and how they could get through this plague, and some of them, of course, did. And perhaps we should have looked a bit more at that when we were taking on these lockdowns and what have you. Here we are, the Great Plague by Samuel Pepys. He stayed up in London during the plague, and he wrote his journal then. And he wrote about looking out of his window and seeing all the bodies. That was it's quite interesting if you ever get to look at some of that. On the other hand, you could set up your own piece of qualitative research, and there's a number of them that are quite interesting. This one here, Learning to Labour, I'll explain that. But there's something called participant observation. In other words, you're going to observe what people are doing, and you're going to be part of the group's activity. So it has to be something that you can do, right? You can't just go off and say, I want to look at people in footballers and how they do it, and whether or not they go and they go on with their thuggish behaviour during the match, after the match, before the match, etc. You can't really do that because I'm talking for most of us, you're too old. You can't get on to their wavelength. They won't accept you. So you'd be asking for trouble trying to be a participant observer. Might get away with being a non-participant observer, but you certainly can't do a participant. You can't go out there and beat up the opposition so that you're in the same people. But you might be able to talk about something like a group of golfers. If you play golf, you could look at how that group of golfers have dealt with the pandemic. You could look at whether or not they've been able to get out onto the golf course and when they could, and how much it has affected them not to be able to get out onto the golf course. You could look at this one. Now, I don't know whether you'd enjoy this, but there is one called The Tea Room Trade by Lord Humphreys, who was trying to, has anyone heard of this book? Anyone? No? Well, he was trying to look at the way that men met each other, and whether or not they found it easy to meet up for sex, basically. And he hung around outside a public convenience to see how the men were, how they went in. And after a while, he decided he wasn't getting very many results from doing this, because they didn't like him hanging around outside. So he said he would be their lookout. And he stood outside for them and watched out for other members of the public who wanted to go in for the proper reasons. So that was a really quite a strong piece of work that someone did. Right? A much more easy to set up one is this non-participant observation. And this man, Paul Willis, and it's quite old now, it was in the about 1980s, I think, and he was looking at a group of boys in a school who pretty well knew that all that they were going to do was go to the local factory and get a job. So when they'd finished school, they were going to go and be ordinary workers on the just on the line to see, to just do this work that their fathers had done before them, and their fathers before that, their grandfathers. They'd done that for years, and they knew that that was what was going to happen to them. So this Paul Willis sat in the classroom for months and observed them. And he said it was fairly awful because they did not behave. They stood on the tables, they shouted, screamed, they were genuinely quite disruptive. And he then followed them into the workplace, and he found that they were exactly the same in the workplace. Disruptive, awkward, as much as they possibly can. But the only difference, of course, was that the management of the workplace could sack them, whereas the teachers couldn't get rid of them. So they ended up behaving a bit better in the workplace, but not a lot. They hadn't learnt anything much at all at school, and they still weren't going to learn it when they went to the workplace. So it was called Learning to Labour, and it's quite an effective book. You sort of feel sorry for these lads. Now, you could do an experiment. Yeah, I'm coming towards the end. I was just checking the time. If we think about it, it's quite difficult to do an experiment, but people did. You've got the Nazis trying to do experiments and so on sociological things, but in the main, you can't do it because it's not morally correct. But there's one very famous one that you may well have even heard about, and it was carried out by a school teacher called Jane Elliott. And what she did, she took her year 3 class, that's quite young, and she did it on, I've got to move that, April the 5th, 1968. And it was the day after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So all the kids came in and they'd all got opinions. And in the main, because it was predominantly a white school, they thought, well, doesn't matter. What difference does it make? They just vaguely agreed that that was what should have happened. So the next day they came into class, and this time she stood at the door And she looked at them and she put those with the brown eyes and those with the blue eyes in different groups, brown and blue. She then discriminated against those with the blue eyes, and notice it was the blue-eyed ones that she's discriminating against to start with. And in the main, the students in the blue-eyed group were somewhat off-put because they couldn't see why they should be discriminated against. Why had they been sent to the back of the classroom when they'd always been quite used to being set towards the front? Now they're at the back. When they put their hands up, she said, "Oh no, you won't know this answer. Put your hand down." So they were definitely being discriminated against. And they thought, you know, well, why is that? And she said, well, it's because of melanin, and melanin is linked to your intelligence and higher intelligence and learning ability, and people with brown eyes have more melanin and therefore they're more highly intelligent. So I'm not really interested in anything that the blue-eyed children say. She didn't tell them that was what the discriminating factor was, but she said, I'm not interested in what you've got to say because you're not clever enough. So here we are, we've got a nice little brown-eyed girl. She was considered to be clever. And shortly after the initial resistance was put up, that fell away, and those that were deemed superior became arrogant, bossy, and otherwise very unpleasant to their inferior classmates. So they went out into the playground and they started to discriminate against the blue-eyed children. They themselves, they had no reason to do so, but that's what they decided. Right, nice little blue-eyed girl, she was being discriminated against. Their grades, surprisingly, their grades changed. So she didn't do it for very long, 3 or 4 days at the most, and their mathematical and reading tasks improved. So the brown-eyed children got better, but the blue-eyed children got worse. Right, and they also became very timid and subservient, and they scored more poorly. This is something I really do feel, that students that are told they're stupid become stupid. You must always bolster their confidence in every way, even if they are the most objectionable child. So, okay, have I got any questions?
Jenny's got a question.
Right.
What is the importance of the number of people that you survey? For certain surveys, you need at least 5,000 people or something like that, don't you? There must be
I think you can take your survey by, you need to have a reasonable number, but you don't need to have huge numbers. And something like the participant observation type exercises, no, that's going to be a fairly small number, 30, maybe 20, 30. He's going to sit there and he's going to watch a class of students, isn't he? And it won't matter that it's not many. I did my own bit of research was on educational outings and whether or not it actually made any difference to a student. Now, of course, it means that I've got to have a group of children who go on an educational outing together. So I went on participant observations and I did non-participant observations, the lot. And I did surveys as well on them. They were all young children, I must admit. So it was quite easy, but I wouldn't say that I had anywhere near thousands, 30, few classes of 30, different classes. getting different results for different things. And I think that it was quite valid. And I did do the thing where you stand in the hall or in the corridor and ask people questions. So I was getting people to fill in a questionnaire as they went by from the local high school, comprehensive.
Yes, I see.
May I say something?
Yeah, do. Who is that?
Now, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, they made experiments about schools.
Yes.
And you know, we have got the system of streaming children, bad children and the good children. Now they did one experiment with quite a mixed class. And they said, you have been chosen because we think you are the best in the whole school. All right? Because of your excellent behavior, your diligence, and your whatever it is.
Yeah.
And the result was they became the very best.
Yeah.
They were not the best. Another thing is, you know, Mr. Whitehall, I think he was an education minister.
Whitelaw, that's the one. Yeah.
He was an education minister,
Yeah.
and he became the headmaster of a school in Hackney. Now, Hackney is really a downtrodden area, and I think, and most children were on school meals, free school meals, and very few people got any GCSEs at all. What he did, he was an excellent teacher. First of all, he introduced a little bit of ethos into the school, putting achievement first before failure. First of all, the children had to behave. As far as I understood, the beginning of the class, everybody said, I will do my best to learn as much as I can and not to disturb anyone. Something like this. I don't know the words. But anyway, after the 8 years at the school, when he came to the A levels, he got children through to Oxford and Cambridge. Now, which means these children, they had practically no chance normally to go to a university, but he had the will. The other thing is, because of his ethos, he installed an ethos in his other colleagues. He said, well, what can we do to help these children? And I think they had after school classes, they had Saturday classes, because they found out that some children, they live in a 1 or 2 bedroom flat with 5 children, so there is no room for them to do their homework properly. So they thought, well, in that case, we have to help them. Anyway, everything was done and the ethos changed. This is the thing. The ethos, and therefore it also attracted good teachers. Yes. Because a good teacher wants a good result. Nothing is more disheartening if you take over a class and you know everybody is going to fail. This is not good for a teacher. A teacher wants to see a result. And this is the only reason why he or she is a teacher. And you see, this Mr. Whitehall or Whitehall or whatever his name was.
I remember.
Yeah, probably you all remember this. This is only a few years ago. And he got it. And also, I believe something similar happened in Newton. Here in the East End, Newham. Yeah, they somehow associated with now the top private school, was it?
Yeah, they had somebody. Eton, wasn't it? Yeah.
And also they got a little bit of emphasis what can be done, and also they saw how they behaved and how the Eton boys behaved and how they behaved, and apparently they got excellent result among their schools. And you see, their children, they were most of them were unprivileged, but got results. So it is a question of instilling something
and believing it as
And
well.
believing
Yes.
it. This is what it is. Yes, so
Barbara.
it's not the question if you do your homework, oh, you are teacher's pet. No.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, yes. Barbara, what did you have to say?
Well, yes, I did some research on practice nurses. I've worked in the health service all my life. I've been vice chairman at Southend Hospital as well, and the governor at Basildon Hospital. And I'd done an open university degree in sociology.
Oh, right.
And they were getting very concerned about nurses in GP practices being asked to do things and whether they were properly prepared and trained to do it. And so I did some research on that, and it was published in the Nurse Practitioner. So, you know, that was quite important because you could see the variations. Some practice nurses were doing quite complex things. And so it was a useful thing that was done for South East Essex Health Authority.
Well, I always believe that you need to bolster the confidence of these less able children, or not less able, but those that without the confidence in their own ability.
I had problems at school because I was the only person in school to be left-handed.
Oh dear.
Yes, I know.
And I was always dragged out in front of the class. I was always embarrassed. They'd done everything they could to make me right-handed, and I couldn't.
No.
So I absolutely hated junior and infant school. But I was lucky enough to have a good teacher at senior school. And in fact, he died this year. And I remain friends with him. He was 19 when he started, and I was obviously 12 or 13. And he made a hell of a difference to my life.
Yeah. I wished I could say I'd made a difference to anyone. I might have made the difference to a few, but not many.
I had the reserve effect as a left-hander. I was educated in junior school in the war. I only went to school for half a day for 3.5 years. Came back and took the scholarship, and passed and went to Brentwood County High.
Yeah, I eventually become a prefect, a head boy, and I went on to college, although I never had a chance to go to County High because it was too late for me.
Oh, well, the geography teacher there, I was left-handed. She said, if your writing goes backwards, so does your character. So I did try very hard. It's pretty unreadable now, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I always think it's weird that my son is a teacher, and he had the most awful results. His GCSEs, and he did do GCSEs, his highest result was my subject of a C in science. He got nothing higher than that. Most of them were D's and E's and U's. They were really bottom of the pile. But as soon as he went to college, I got rung up, and I can remember it. I got rung up. Can you come in, please? So I thought, oh God, it's starting again. It's all going to be the same. So in I go, and they said, well, we're so pleased with him. He's such a wonderful example to the rest of the class. He does all his work. He never did any work for us, but he's doing it for them. And he comes out with a distinction, and he goes off to university. His spelling is still appalling, absolutely awful. I don't know how his pupils can put up with it, but they must do. I don't think he writes too much on the whiteboard, but but it came out really because they believed in him, I think. And we had lost touch with him. We didn't. So I feel very guilty that we thought that he was a bit dim. And he wasn't. He was quite clever.
Yeah. I eventually became engineering manager for Unilever for the south of England.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it, that you can do these things?
Yes.
But I do think, I mean, I do remember we had one really bad staff meeting. That was it. And we were all sitting around and analysing the results from the previous year. And someone said, oh, well, the English results are really poor. And they said, yes, well, they weren't very good pupils, were they? They were very poor. So I piped up and I said, but our results in chemistry, physics and biology are very good. Oh, well, I don't know how you achieved that. So I said, well, I think it's probably because we believed they were going to be good. And you didn't.
Oh, yes. Encouragement.
But that's what sociology is all about. It's quite exciting.
Yes.
You can do all sorts of things in sociology. You can do religious stuff. So you look at religion and how the difference in the religions have gone. That can be. I'm not at all religious. I don't believe in God. I'm sorry, but I don't. But I found the religion absolutely fascinating, and how it's altered their lives completely because they believe in these various different types of God. So the Hindus are completely different from the Muslims, etc. But that was exciting. The education is exciting. The workforce, when you look at workforce, that's exciting. So you've got all these different bits of sociology that you probably didn't think were important, but they are when you start looking at them. Yes, Elma.
Yes, there's another thing about back to education. I've mainly taught children, German children who are Germans, but I also taught in English schools German to English children. All right. So, but never full time, always here and there a bit. And what I was quite amazed. They had different classes, and they said, "Oh yes, in this class, practically everybody is on free school meals, so don't expect much." I thought, what has intelligence to do with free school meals or with the poverty of your parents? Nothing whatsoever. What has it to do that you went to Eton? It is because your parents had deep pockets. Nothing else. This is not your personal achievement. It is your parents who sent you there. And if your parents are poor, and at the moment, I think we speak about a lot of poverty, these children can't help it. That is not their fault. And then to say, oh, you can't achieve anything, you are not an A level or A star person because of poverty, that is totally wrong. But it is very much ingrained in teachers, I must say. And I could never understand this. I found this, it was a very stupid excuse for not trying hard enough, to instilling enough belief in them. I think even those people who are so poor, they need even more attention, more encouragement.
And they need people to believe that they can do it.
That's right, yes.
Yes, and if they don't believe, then they're not going to have it.
That's right.
Christine, you were going to say something.
Yes.
Yes, the experiment that the teacher did with the children with blue eyes, brown eyes, were the parents aware that that experiment was going on? Because I wonder what the children said when they went home about what was happening.
Yeah, I don't know, because I think at first, no. But I think she continued with this experiment. She became quite well known for it, and she did it in other settings. So she actually went into the local Marine base and did much the same experiment. And she found that the soldiers behaved in very much the same way as the children did. So if they were believed in, they did well. And if they weren't, then they did badly. And so they were not asked to give their permission, because they couldn't be really, could they? Because it would have spoilt the experiment. But I think that the parents must have been told, but I can't see the first time how she did, because she literally did it the next day. She said she was fuming about what the children had been saying in the playground, and she wanted to teach them a lesson. And you don't have to tell the parents anything, really, do you?
No.
Not really on that sort of thing.
Well, it depends on the outcome, I think, doesn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, she actually did it quite surprisingly. She turned it completely round the other way after a week or so. So she made the blue eyes one the most intelligent and the brown eyed ones the least intelligent. By that time, she told the children what they were doing.
Thank you.
I found that experiment, actually it was also on, you can go online and you can pick it up. There's put in her name and you'll see it coming up. There was a documentary done about it. And it's quite interesting what she discovered. I thought that, you know, she did a very interesting piece of work. There's not too many sociological experiments that you can do, but you can do some. Not legitimately anyway.
Could sociology explain why I was supplied with a knife as part of my Scouts uniform?
Oh, yes.
And now it's illegal for me to take it out of the house.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah. I know. All my relatives were very, very much into the Scout movement. Interestingly, one of them, my grandfather, so we're talking about 1900s, I suppose. He'd have been in the Scouts to start with. And it was almost like it rescued him, because he was a Peckham Street boy. So he was a badly behaved boy running in the market, stealing, etc. And this man came along from the Scout group and took him in under his wing, and it turned his whole ideas of life around, and probably meant that I went to university.
But I always looked at a knife as a tool. Nowadays, it's looked as a weapon.
As a weapon, yeah.
Hence
I know
the
he had
numbers that have died in that group after 20 that you were quoting earlier. They went up tremendously with the stabbings that are taking place now all the time.
Yeah, it's hard to follow, but I mean, there's got to be people like sociologists who are doing these different pieces of work on it, aren't they? They've got to find out how to get rid of this knife crime and what have you, and whether we can do anything to change the street culture.
Yeah, I was taught that a knife was a tool. And
yes.
I knew how to use it as a tool. And if I got involved in a punch-up, you never even think of drawing a knife on the person you were having a scrap with.
But you know, you'd
end up with a bloody nose or whatever, or black eye. But you'd never draw a knife. And both of us would have been armed at that time with a knife.
So, yeah.
But they weren't used as a weapon then. They are now.
Well, even ones that we cut up with are used as a weapon if needed.
Oh, yes. All knives are used as weapons, or seem to be. I was chairman of Essex Victim Support for quite some time, and it bothers me indeed the amount of knives there are about here now and are used as weapons.
One of the interesting things about knives is that quite often the knife epidemic that we have at the moment is related to drug use. And, you know, a lot of these deaths are related to gang warfare related to drug use.
Yeah. So, I don't know, what time is it? It's 3:30. Shall I summarise and then so. We can say our goodbyes, etc.?
Yes, please.
If you would, please. Okay. And also.
Right. Okay. Let me see how I get back to where I was. Down there. Right. So, summarising. So, let's look at it. Right, so we are calling the sort of, don't seem to be able to get back. Why aren't I getting back? From current slides.
It does say summarising on the screen, Laura.
Yeah, I know, but it's not the actual.
You can try right at the bottom. There's a picture of a screen that might do it, just to the left of the negative sign. Further along, further right, further right.
Further right.
That one. Try that one.
Yeah. Right, there we go. Yeah, summarising. Yeah. Otherwise, you see the whole thing rather than bit by bit. Right. So summarising. We've discussed if we can call sociology a science. I think it is. That's despite what I thought about it when I was taking chemistry as a degree subject. I thought it was just a lot of long-haired lefties that just were basically doing it as a bit of fun. It is a science. I did actually teach chemistry for 20 years, and now I've probably done sociology about the same. So I'm a bit between the two. I must be one of the very few people that has done both. As a scientist, sociologists do carry out research, such as those that involve statistics, those that involve observation, those that involve interviews, and those that involve experiments. There aren't that many with the experiments for fairly obvious reasons. But in the same way as physics, these researches are repeatable by the peer group. And that's crucial to be able to call it a true science. And the results of such research is of overwhelming interest to the general population, which I think is interesting because other than a few bits and pieces of physics and chemistry, it's all got a bit above general population. So what we're interested in sociology is probably of more interest to people than the straightforward bit of physics that we did. We really, what am I doing at the moment? My grandson is asking me to go through specific heat capacity. Well, I don't think anybody in the general population is particularly keen to know what the specific heat capacity of water is. But they do want to know about why their children don't do well in education, or why they do well in education. So in many ways, sociology has become more pertinent to the people, the general people, than any of the more hard scientists. And so that's all, folks.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. You certainly given us a lot of, put a pun on it, food for thought. One of the interesting things while you've been talking, I've been thinking about another area I was involved in, and that is your attitude towards everything. And working for an American company, many of the self-help phrases and books, the power of PMA, not MNA. Was the power of
PMA?
positive mental attitude, not negative mental attitude.
Yes.
And one phrase that's come back to me while we're talking, it's your attitude, not your aptitude, that determines your altitude.
Yes. Very good. Very good. Yes.
Well, that didn't come from me. That's come from 15, 20 years ago when I was working. And also, I'm a great believer in a one word. Lots of people use a phrase which really irritates me because it's complete nonsense. Not too bad. There's one much better word than that. The word is reasonable.
Yes.
Which means far more than NTB. I mean, there was a thing in the Essex Chronicle some years ago about somebody whose name was Notzer, because every word he said was not too bad. And we used to work with somebody, and I came in one day and said, "How are you?" And he said, "Not too bad." And an hour or two later, I said to him, "There's something wrong with you." He said, "I got really bad toothache." I said, "When I came in, you said Notzer." And anyway, I found a dentist for him that day, but that's another story. The other thing is, bring it right up to date, is a really joyful thing that we had last weekend, Emma Raducanu. And one of the things really about Emma Raducanu is a lot of tennis players are just taught, or juvenile tennis players from 5 onwards, just to concentrate purely on tennis, whereas she didn't. She was taught in a range of activities. And it's come across that she's a very well-rounded human being. And of course, she achieved an incredible feat last weekend. So I sort of link all this in with what you've been saying and what you're saying, because it's a power of positivity and thinking can do, not can't do, or I don't know if we can do this, I don't know if we can do that. So I found your talk very interesting from your angle as to sociology. So thank you very much for preparing this talk and giving your time to it and Zooming with us. So thank you very much on behalf of Chelmsford Science Group, Chelmsford U3A Science Group. So thank you, Laura, for your time.
Thank you for giving me the opportunities. Thank you.